Alright, so you got your DeDe in the mail and you're ready to do some assembly. A little bit of soldering required. You should have all the parts inside this anti-static bag, and we're going to go ahead and open it up. Careful not to lose any parts. I try not to put any extras in there. Pull everything out, and there's everyone's favorite piece, hopefully, the DeDe board in all of its glory. I leave this Kapton tape on top of the dip switches. If we can get a good view of that, you'll see it's got that orange tape on there. That's put on by the manufacturer of these dip switches. Most of these boards, when they're in high volume manufacturing, after the soldering process, they go through a washing process, basically a long wash machine with soapy water and stuff to clean off any of the flux residue. They put that tape on there to keep any of the water from getting inside of the switch itself. So you can leave it on there if you're not going to use the analog channels as analogs. If you're just going to keep using them as digital. But if you think you're ever going to use them as analog inputs, just peel this tape off there and you can get to the dip switches. So we've got the DeDe board, got the breadboard, and a green set of headers. We'll use that. That's optional. You may or may not use these. If you want to use the prototyping area for soldering down something more permanent, you can leave the breadboard off. Some people had asked about, can they take something like a nano and use that on here and just solder the wires to all the pins that are going around the outside, and use this as basically an adapter board so you can plug regular Arduino Uno shields on top. You can do that. It looks like this will also work with other boards from like SparkFun, like probably the ESP8266 or ESP32 boards. I haven't done it yet, but you could probably use this, get creative, and wire the digital IOs to the pins, and use this as a breakout board for that as well, and use it with the any shields you like. So then we got that. We'll be using the yellow headers. That's where you're going to connect your test equipment to if you want. DMMs, oscilloscope, logic analyzers, protocol analyzers. These are the 6 user wires that will connect to the 3 pins for the user area over here. If you want to use it as like a logic probe for other parts of your circuit, you can set that aside. We've got the 2-pin jumper. That'll be for the disable. If you want to plug this across the 2 pins for the disable, it basically shuts down the power supply for the LEDs and lowers the amount of current. Don't need that yet. We will be using the headers. You should have a 1x6, a couple of 1x8s, a 1x10, and then the 2x3 header. And last but not least, you'll have the 2 little ground test points. So I like to start working from the outside in. The biggest mistake that people will probably make, and I know that because I made it several times in the early phases of this project, is putting the headers into the wrong sockets or the wrong pins on here. So if we start from the outside in, start with the yellow headers. We'll place those first because they're shorter than what the headers are. They won't stick up as much, and I'll explain why in a moment, just how long or why that's the case. I use a pair of cutters, and I'm going to start by cutting off, and after I turn on the light for my microscope here, my eyes aren't what they used to be, so I do this under a microscope. But we need a 1x10. So looking closely, that's 9. Let's do 10. Measure twice, cut once. So there's a 10 pin. We're going to need a pair of 8s. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 8. We need another 8. That doesn't look right. We're going to do 8. We need a 1x6. Those will be for the analog pins. And then we're going to need 3 pins for the user jumpers, the user headers, and then the 2 pins for the disable. And you should have an extra 3 pins left over. You can throw it away or hang on to it. I tend to keep everything, so I'll set that aside. I'm going to set aside the breadboard and the pins for that for now, as well as the headers and the ground posts, but keeping everything nearby. So I start by putting the outer ones in first. I'll do the 1x10, 1x8 next to it, 1x8 on the opposite side with all the power supply pins and reset, and then the 1x6 for the analog. And just set them in there like this. And one of the tricks I found out to keep them held in place while I flip this over is I got a little piece of cardboard I cut out of a mailing envelope. I'll place that on there, flip it over. You can either leave it there or you can slide it out if you want. That pretty much keeps the pins fairly straight. Make sure that you're on the outside pins. Don't solder these onto the inner rows unless that's really the way you plan on using it. The next row over, the inner rows, are where the little black headers are going to go for the shields. And if you want to be able to attach shields, it needs to be in the correct holes. So I use a small wedge soldering iron tip. And you'll probably, 25, 35 watt soldering iron should work well. I've found that these brass tip cleaners work the best, better than sponges. Use what you like. Pick your favorite flavor of solder. I use a water soluble solder wire, fine. I think it's 0.062 inch diameter, and it's got a rosin core to it. This is Rojas, so there's no lead inside of it. But the water soluble means that the flux, you can wash it away with hot water in the sink. And I start by tacking down just one pin in each of those 4 headers I just put down. And I usually pick the end. You could probably pick one in the middle, but solder down one of them. I go to the next one. Go to the other side. And I can tell, I'm looking under the microscope, whether or not these pins are relatively straight or not. If they're sticking straight up, then I'm in the ballpark at least. The main thing is that they're sticking this through the board as much as possible. And we'll get the last one here. The solder tip touches the solder pad on the PCB itself, and then it also touches the pin that I'm soldering to. So I heat up both of them at the same time, and then I just push the solder in between the two of them. So anyway, so now I can turn it over without risk of these things falling out. I want to look at it side on and make sure that they're straight. They should be perpendicular to the board, and also that they're laying flat on the board. So I can look at the edges and see that they're laying up against the board nicely. On this one, same thing. You can see that they're laying down nicely. So they're on good and straight. And so the next thing I'll do is I'm going to put the user pins on there. This little 3-pin header, we'll put that over here. And then the 2 pins for the disabled jumper. Use the same trick with the piece of cardboard. Flip it over. I'll just leave it on there this time. And do the same thing. We're just going to solder one of the pins in each of those 2 headers I just placed down. We got one here. There we go. And we got one here. Alright, so now push this guy aside. I want to lose the ground post. Now I can do the same thing and look and see that, are they relatively flat? They are. They're laying against the board. They're pretty straight. Now if you put it in and they're laying crooked or something, what I usually do, since I've only got one pin soldered down, I can put my fingers on the other pins that don't have solder on them, and then what I'll do is I'll apply heat to the one pin that does have solder on it, and then use my fingers to push it up against the board and also to straighten it out, making sure that my finger's not on, and your finger in this case isn't on the pin that's getting heated up, because you're going to notice it pretty quick. But it's pretty easy to touch the other pins, straighten it out, go back, check, and double check before you start soldering the rest of the pins down, because it's much easier to make a change with only one of the pins soldered down, as opposed to having 10 or 8 or 6 soldered down. That's more painful. Plus, at this point, you can make sure that, yep, I've got the headers soldered in the outer pins and not the inner ones. I have to stress that because it will happen. Everything's in its right place. So we're going to go through and solder the rest of these. Alright, so now we've got everything. Get soldered on there. Pretty good to go there. So that should look good. Now if you're going to put the breadboard on and you want to use the green headers around there, now's a good time to do these. So I do the headers because they're shorter than, or the male headers at least, I do those first because they're shorter than what the female headers stand up. If you put they're pretty close, but I find that if I solder all these on there first before I put the shield headers on, the board sits a little bit lower. I do the shortest components first and then the tallest last. The only kind of exception is the ground test pins, because they're springy enough they hold themselves into the holes without any problems. But when you flip it over, you don't want these things to go settle down and not stick up all the way through the holes. You want them to press up through the holes as much as possible. So for this one, I'm going to go ahead and do these. And what I usually do, or have been doing at least, is I'll lay it in to the big one first. So if you get the big one wrong, you can always cut it up into smaller ones and use it for, try to reuse it for the other holes. And then I cut off to size, just snip that. I think there are, let's see, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 pins if you want to count it out. And the other ones you need are a 6 and a pair of 8s. So start with the 8s first. That's 8. And that is 8. And if all went well, you should have a 6 left. And that's for the analog pins. So you should use all 40 pins for the green headers. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go ahead and place those into their respective holes around the prototyping area. And again, this part's optional. If you're going to solder your project down to the breadboard area, you can skip past this and just set the breadboard and these headers aside. And get my handy dandy piece of cardboard out. I was using my fingers to kind of hold them in, and you can still do that. Especially on the outer ones, it's easier. You can just kind of hold them, put some pressure on them, and hold them at an angle and flip it over. The inner ones are a little more difficult. You can also kind of grab the pins this way, but I found this to be much more reliable. So, got all those in there. They look reasonably straight. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to tack one pin of each of those 4 headers down first, and then I'll make sure that they're straight before I go any further. Alright, one of each. And I can look at it and see those 2 are laying down flat, that's flat. And then look at it from the edge and see if they're perpendicular to the board. It should be sticking straight up. And I can see where this one is tilted a little bit. So I'm going to put my fingers on some of the pins that aren't going to get hot. And then I'm going to touch the soldering iron to this one pin and kind of look at the thing kind of off to the end on, and until it looks straight. Let the solder cool. That's much better. Still flat. Yep, still flat all the way across the board. Sometimes when I'm soldering these strips, I'll see one end is down and the other end kind of wants to float up. So what I started doing is I'll go tack solder the other end down just to keep it from rising up on accident. It's not critical, but I like to keep them flat. Makes it look nicer. But cool, look at it. Yep. So the 18-pin job is laying across there flat. The other ones are short enough that they're not going to come up much, if anything. I can see this one's off by a little bit too. Little 6-pin job is just by a few degrees, but again, we'll go on there and I'm going to touch the soldering iron to the one pin that is soldered. Look at it, or you can kind of feel if it's straight or not. And there we go. Still flat on the board. All of them are. Everything looks straight, or at least straight enough. We're good to go. So now I can go through and solder the rest of them down. And there you have it. So now we've got all of them soldered in. I got the camera hanging upside down, so that makes this kind of difficult. And that's our board. So we got those done. Now you can do either one at this point. I'm going to go ahead and put the ground pins in, and those should just snap into the hole and keep it from sticking to my fingers. Snap it all the way in. Twist it to whatever angle you want. I like to have them, let's see, at that kind of an angle. You can see that. You can see through the loop or whatever. For the P clips that you hook onto. That way it's kind of easier to hook on two of them, but it really doesn't matter. Just a personal preference. And then we're going to put the other one in its hole, push it in until it snaps. It's already got the orientation I like. Twist this one a little bit more. So now I'll flip it over. Let's see. And I'll go solder those next. I put a lot of solder in these. I make sure I fill that hole and that connector up really well. And it's going to take a little bit of heat because that's such a big pad and it's a lot of metal wire heating up. Plus it's attached to the ground plane on the bottom side of the board, which tends to wick away the heat. So you may have to hold the iron on there a little bit longer than some of the other pins. I'll just get it started. Let the connection heat up, and then I just go dump solder in there. You want a good solid connection anyway, good solid mechanical connection, because we tend to tug on these things a little bit with our probes and everything. So that's that. Those guys are soldered on there. Looking good. So now all we have left are the shield headers. So we'll start by placing those in. Doesn't matter what order. The pins may be bent a little bit. A lot of them came that way. Most of them are fairly straight, so it may take a little bit to get them to push through. 6, I get to 8. We got the 8. It's hard to tell from this distance which ones aren't wanting to go in. There we go. If you get lucky and they're all straight, then go play the lottery. Hey, there we go. That's what we like. So we do the 6, the 2 8s, and the 10 first. Lay those in there. And you can look at it from the side and you see they just stick up slightly above what the headers are. That's why these are the male headers for the test points and the breadboard connection points. And that's why I make these last. Flip it over. And we'll use the same process, same theory. Tack one pin down on each of those 4 headers first. And it's pretty easy to see if they're going to be straight or not. I can move it around and see that, yep, those are fairly straight. And go tack solder one on each one of these now. Be careful not to let solder get up. Try not to solder the pins. It's going to make it more difficult to plug into other shields. Try to keep it at the base, and it's pretty easy. The solder is going to wick down the hole for the most part, and get a nice little fillet on top is what you want. Pins are looking pretty straight, standing up perpendicular. A little solder in there. Alright, so now get rid of this, flip it over, and now look, and these are a little more critical than the male pins to make sure that they're perpendicular and straight and laying flat, because your shields are going to have to plug into these. And then the same thing, DeDe's going to have to be able to plug into the Arduino Uno or whatever board you've got beneath it. So it's really important to get these straight, and I can see where I'm off just a little bit on the 10-pin header. So what I'm going to do is, I kind of got the header and the pins pinched between my fingers. And heat up the one pin, straighten it out a little bit, let it cool, and look at it. That's much better. And you can kind of look at the plane of the board and see that they're laying flat, both these guys and then also for these guys too. Check, double check if it looks good. I think in the early times I used to even plug like another shield on top of it to make sure that they're aligned correctly. You can try that if you want, but this works out pretty well. If it looks good visually, it's probably going to be fine. Plus, you know, these pins, the first time you plug them into a base board like the Uno, they're going to be off just a little bit, but the first time you get them sunk into something, plugged in, they retain their shape really well, and the second time it gets easier and easier to plug them in. So let's go and solder the rest of these down. And there we go. And that should do it for the soldering. And back this guy out. Sorry for all the reflections and stuff. The headers. That should be about what you got. Everything looks pretty straight. You look at it down the side. And there you go. That's the hard part. Now the easy part, oh, almost forgot. We got the 2x3 left. I'm going to put the 2x3 header. And remember, that goes on from the other side. And I usually have to spread these pins out just a little bit. My tweezers, it's just perfect thickness for sticking it in there and prying them apart, getting the right pitch. And this guy's got to go on the bottom side. So make sure you get this on the bottom side. It's just the opposite of all the other headers. So this guy goes through there. Those pins, these pins for the headers, stick way down there. Stick out a lot further than this does. So if you do it like this, the header is going to want to, is not going to be flat to the board. So what I've been doing is I just use the flat part of my tweezers and prop it up. And use the same process. I'm just going to solder one pin down first. Got that. Okay, now we got it on there. I can check and make sure it's flat. It's reasonably flat, but I'll push my finger up against the plastic. If it's not flat, melt the one pin that you got soldered down there until it pushes down flat to the board, and there you go. Now it's set. Perfect. Just the way we like it. So now I don't need the tweezers to hold it up anymore. Let's go and do the other two pins on that side of the connector. These pins just pass through. They're not connected to anything on DeDe itself, with the exception of the ground pin here. This pin 1, it is grounded to the rest of the DeDe board. The other 5 pins are strictly just pass through and don't go anywhere on DeDe itself. There we go. Now I can see where they're off just a little bit. I'm going to pry these back apart. Eyeball the spacing. I'll make it easier the first time that you try to plug it into an Uno. And there we go. Done deal.